Chapter 306. They look really similar to the puppet soldiers on my side, it's like a palette swap in a game, or a rare skin. Roland was looking at the kindling forces that arrived from the north side where his fort was. Their appearance was close to the Timberling soldiers that were on his side but with a few changes. The wood they were made of was a bit darker and they had some flames coming out of their wooden heads. He was not sure if they were purely cosmetic or a source of some sort of magical attack, but this would become apparent in the coming battle. My lord, the enemy numbers in the hundreds, what are your orders? Just stick to the plan for now, as expected they have more soldiers than us, but it shouldn't be a problem if they stick to the route. His aide was standing right next to him and only was capable to give him an arbitrary number of the enemy forces. On the side of the Timberlings there were 50 soldiers, all of them able to gain their second Tier 1 class enhancement. Considering he took their talents into consideration, he ended up with 20 spearmen, 20 swordsmen, and 10 archers. Then within them, they had a subset of spearmen using shields with shorter spears while others used longer ones. From a glance, it seemed that the kindling forces had about 4 times as many people as they did. If they met each other on an open field, then the result would be an obvious loss of all his soldiers. However, this was a defensive battle, and even though the walls of this settlement weren't that high, they would still need to be destroyed before they were able to directly attack his forces. The enemy is approaching, archers, raise your bows. The wooden soldier captain that had leveled up to level 60 this week started giving out commands. The archers that were equipped with exploding arrows would be the center point of this defensive strategy. If they did their job well, then he expected the small enemy army to be eradicated before they reached the gateway inside. North was where his Motte and Bailey fort was facing and where the entrance gateway was built. It was slightly more robust than the walls on the sides, and a bridge made of logs could be extended over the moat. At this moment it had been pulled back inside the castle so that the enemy forces would have to contend with the shallow waters and mud. Roland would have loved to have some time to expand his defenses, but he didn't have enough funds for it. After creating the bare-bones facilities for his villagers, he didn't have much to spend on the defenses. He was able to scrunch enough to build a wooden rampart for the 10 archers to stand on. From there they could use their ranged attacks against the opposition. Next to the 10 archers stood 10 shield swordsmen that would protect them from any enemy fire that was coming. Down on the ground, the spearmen waited. There were some small holes in the log walls that could be used by them. If the enemies arrived and tried scaling them, they would get poked to death. Roland wasn't sure if it would come to this part though. This was not a normal wave of mindless monsters, but something that was simulating human behavior. If everything went as he planned it out, then a huge blow would be dealt to the invaders. Normally, after suffering big losses, a commander should decide to pull out. Perhaps their forces would lose enough morale to even flee by themselves. It was an interesting factor in this trial that also affected his own forces. Back in the throne room where he could command everything, there was a morale counting for the army. The wooden captain would raise this stat of the troops that was giving them a buff to their numbers. The same was with him, he was considered a special unit, like a hero, and whenever he was close to his troops they would be stronger. Just standing here on the rampart with the archers would boost their stats by a few levels. My lord, please take shelter in the fort and leave this to the soldiers. What if something happens to you? Nothing will happen to me. Now order the archers to begin. Yes, lord. Roland also noticed that his role as the lord was somewhat special. While he was increasing the stats of his soldiers when standing here, the buff might be lost and turn into a debuff if he wasn't careful. When he actually engaged in battle and got injured himself, it would probably affect the soldiers in a negative way, just like in the real world. Most of the time nobles hung out behind strong defense lines where they continued to give orders. If they were killed or captured, the fighting was usually over. If he looked at it as a strategy game, then he was a special unit with unique abilities and worth. He could probably give out a moral boost that was of a higher degree than any of his commander units, but if he was defeated in battle or even injured, it could adversely affect his troops. This was the same for the opposition. If their leader was defeated, then if they didn't have anyone to take over, the battle would be over. Finally, the charge was started and signaled by a toot of a war horn. The enemy wooden soldiers started charging with spears raised. Their composition was very simple and consisted mostly of spearmen and archers. The only mounted unit was their leader that was giving out orders on top of a wooden horse, which made the whole scene quite bizarre to the only human here. Not much of a formation there, they are just diving towards the main gate where the archers are stationed. Is this because this is just the beginning of the trial, or because they are low-leveled and it limits their strategy? The enemy had the number advantage, which gave them the edge. The wooden walls made from logs wouldn't last for long, and from afar he also spotted some wooden ladders being carried behind the troops that were charging. They intended to just scale the short walls and jump over before continuing with the assault. The archers that were visible were probably their main target of this rush, as they could have attempted to get in from the sides instead. Well, maybe he doesn't want to thin out his troops, there aren't that many of them and this is a small-scale battle. Roland had prepared some tactical mines which were placed on the south, west, and east sides of his city. They were spread out to signal them if anyone attempted to sneak in an attack. During this maddened rush it would have been an opportunity to sneak in from the back or from the sides, but nothing went off. Neither did the scout unit that was hiding outside activate the specially made runic device. It was time to move into phase first of the plan that was hastily prepared by him and his one and only aide. The archers took aim and started attacking the troops on the outer edges. The arrows didn't even need to collide with their bodies, as connecting with the ground was enough to produce a magical explosion. Roland wanted to cry a bit on the inside after seeing the first arrow go up in smoke. There was not even a full week for him to prepare the ammunition, as the blacksmith NPC couldn't copy his runic designs. He was forced to inscribe each arrow tip by himself and without the possibility of drinking any mana potions. With the lack of any magical parchment at his disposal, he needed to use the little iron that was given to him. Even though the iron ore mine had been discovered and was already operational, it didn't have enough output to keep up with the demand. He needed to burn through all the resources he was given, and now the enemy troops were being guided towards some of his creations. While the arrows packed a lot of power and were able to kill a wooden soldier in one hit, they weren't hitting the target constantly. They had a large assortment of ammunition that their glorious lord had stayed up almost the entire week making. Even though some of them missed, they did their job of funneling them toward a certain location. It's working, they are getting onto it. Roland had a lot of experience with explosives and earth magic. It wasn't a new tactic to lure opponents into a more favorable location while acting meek. The archers on top of the walls didn't look that strong, and the flimsy walls that could be easily broken down or scaled were just a distraction. The true force was packed underground in small pockets that wouldn't be discovered even by an experienced mage. The moment the wooden soldiers crossed a point, the trap started activating. It was set up on a delay so that there was enough time for each and every mine to go off while someone was in the vicinity. Only the set planted directly in front of their moat would explode instantly, and finally, the fireworks started. Boom! A group of wooden people was thrown into the air by an explosive rune. It was inscribed onto a thin plate made from pig iron and had enough power to produce a Tier 2 explosive spell. Soon, like dominoes, each and every magical explosive that was in the vicinity was going off. The troops' charge was halted and they were all going up in flames without Roland needing to engage them in battle. Will they retreat or continue? More than half of the enemy forces had gone up in flames, and the ones that survived were starting to backpedal. They had lost their morale and started deserting. Even when their commander was there, a loss of more than half their troops in one go was devastating. Perhaps if their leader was better he would be able to rally his men once again, but instead, he started attacking some of the retreating soldiers. This worked to an extent, as he was able to halt some from escaping, but several had scattered to the sides where he couldn't reach. From a force that numbered about 200 strong, they were now closer to his forces. They had not even been able to breach their walls or placed any of their ladders and temporary bridges to get through the moat. It didn't take a genius to realize that the battle was over and they wouldn't have enough troops to get inside. Cowards! All you can do is hide behind your walls and use vile magic. I challenge your leader to a duel. Does he dare to face me in single combat? To Roland's surprise, an unforeseen element emerged in the trial. His forces had managed to push back the enemy by just guiding them into a trap. He had lost none of his troops while the enemy had suffered a loss of 70%. Normally this would be enough to end this encounter, but this commander wanted to take him on as an individual. Interesting, could this give me a better grade for the trial if I accept it, or will it worsen it? Roland had not forgotten that this place was only a trial, everything here was fake and was made for a reason. This was just the first part of it, and even now he didn't ignore the possibility of there being levels to it. His choice of not entering the fray was also dependent on what he thought the trial expected from him. The basis for this conclusion was due to reading up on other Tier 3 trials. If it wasn't something plain like defeating monsters or gaining an item from a castle, it could have hidden checkpoints. Roland thought about what he was trying to be, an overlord, someone that was supposed to lead a city while also crafting up a storm. The latter part he performed by designing all the weapons for his army and also by making all the explosives. The first part was different, a lord couldn't just put himself in danger without a good cause, and his people depended on him to survive and perform his tasks. It wouldn't be hard for him to jump into the swarm of low-level puppets and kill them all himself. Putting himself in unnecessary danger if there were other ways to protect his lands would probably lower the hidden grade. If he was wrong, then it would be fine as well, the only thing that he would lose was some sleep, and all of his troops were still alive. How dare he call our liege a coward? Our lord is not scared of anyone, he is the strongest of all the lords, not like yours that send out a foot soldier instead of coming to face us. Roland noticed that the aide that was with him started getting mad and slinging insults at the enemy commander. At first, he thought the wooden man would tell him to not engage with the enemy leader, but it didn't seem that way. During the shouting, it was becoming clear that he actually wanted him to see his lord battle this man on the horse. To simplify things even further, after stepping forward and meeting the gaze of the wooden commander, he was given a message. "Will you accept the duel from the enemy commander?" The trial was pushing him towards this confrontation. At the time he was given the option to refuse as his forces were winning, but perhaps this was something that he could use to his advantage later. It was also an opportunity to see where this went, and considering that his opponent wasn't that strong, there was no reason to refuse the challenge. "I accept your challenge." The moment he spoke those words, a strange phenomenon started taking place. Outside his wooden fortress, a ring of around 30 meters in diameter started forming on the ground. Where before there were chunks of fallen wooden men, a flat surface was being formed. All the bodies and mangled weapons were pushed outside. The ring started flashing a bit as if it was trying to send some kind of signal, and this prompted the enemy commander to move toward it and dismount. After grabbing his weapon of choice, which was a large halberd, he entered the ring, where he began standing without moving a muscle. "I guess that's the battle arena. It doesn't look like the other soldiers will attack me while I'm in there." During this week Roland had worked without rest to create a lesser version of his armor. There wasn't much to work with, as what he was left with was just a pair of steel gauntlets, reinforced steel boots, and an old iron breastplate that had already been there before. It allowed him to use some lesser spells, but should be more than enough for his coming battle. They all are acting a bit strange. His own forces opened up the gate for him without Roland even needing to order them. It was as if he was inside a cinematic that he couldn't interact with after accepting the challenge. The ring began to flash a bit faster, which made him believe that he only had limited time to get to it. Perhaps if he waited for too long, the duel would be halted and it would look as if he got cold feet. "Foolish lord, this will be your resting ground, your head will be proof of my loyalty to the true lord of these lands." "HOH, is that so? You really think you can beat me with those stats?" Name: Wooden Commander level 105. Classes: Wooden Warrior level 25. Wooden Soldier level 25. Wooden Soldier Captain level 50. Wooden Commander level 5. His opponent raised his large halberd and was ready to charge. Roland took a moment to look at the levels and realized that this would be the next upgrade to his own captain. The wooden puppet before him was close to his height and a lot more robust looking. He was even wearing a full set of half-plate armor made of steel. One of the reasons that he accepted this challenge was the gear this unit was wearing, which would let him enhance his fighting capabilities even further. Have at you! Become my stepping stone! Yes, yes! Roland pointed out with his hand at the large wooden soldier that started charging at him. Before he could come anywhere near the new lord of the fort, a blue bolt of energy shot forward, and even though a deflection was attempted with the large halberd, the weapon buckled under the pressure before being slammed back. It wasn't much of a battle really. The level difference was too high, and Roland never intended to let the wooden puppet get near him. In a battle of brawn against magic, magic usually came out on top when a mage was able to cast their spell. In Roland's case, where he could circumvent chanting, this battle became target practice. In under a minute the duel was over, and the puppet's head exploded from a well-placed mana arrow to the face. Congratulations on your victory, the rewards will be presented to you now. Chapter 307. Congratulations on your victory, the rewards will be presented to you now. Rewards. A pop-up message appeared before him out of nowhere. It looked similar to the usual world message, but the usual white text over the black bar was changed to a green bar. The moment it appeared, a strange occurrence took place. His opponent's body, which had been turned into wood chippings, started to flicker before vanishing. The ring of fire that had been around them was also gone, and the enemy army, which still had around 50 soldiers, started to run away. Apparently, without an officer or leader-type unit, they would lose all will to fight. In Roland's mind, this was something that would only work in a small-scale battle like this. Probably if there was another unit like the wooden commander present, then it would have taken over. Those tooltips did say something about the wooden captain being able to command a small force. Perhaps there is a proper number for it, maybe 50 soldiers at most. He wasn't sure, but all of the wooden soldiers and their variants had some type of description. Roland needed to read between the lines in some cases, as the trial wouldn't offer him all the information outright. Perhaps if he wanted to send out his own troops, he would need to split them out into smaller battalions. At least the commander was able to lead a small army of troops of around 250. It dropped the armor and the halberd. While thinking about his future, a strange occurrence was taking place. The leader unit that he had defeated in single combat, or at least what was left of its mangled wooden body, started to flash. Within a few seconds, the flashing started to turn into a rapid flickering. Then in a flash, the body of the one he slew vanished, and like in a game left some loot behind. Roland picked up the large halberd and quickly noticed that it was made from a slightly better alloy than regular steel. The half-plate armor that the commander was wearing wasn't much better than what he had on, but when analyzing one of the parts with the help of this world's system, he was given some more information. Commander's half-plate chest piece, intermediate. Grade, C. Bonuses. Increases the number of units a leader can command into battle by 50. Interesting, that just confirms my previous guess, and it actually gave me the whole number now. If he assumed that his captain could control around 50 units, this chest piece would double his ability to lead. The other pieces didn't really have any bonuses and were all made from regular steel. The grade was at an intermediate level, which was below something he could make by himself. Normally he would replace the breastplate he made himself, but considering the bonuses, it would probably be better to give it to his captain unit. I'm probably seen as a special unit by the system controlling this trial. Wouldn't be strange if I was only limited by the number of units my settlements can contain. Usually, in strategy games, each base had a limit of residents that it could contain. This was usually a limitation brought by the game's system itself, as there wouldn't be enough computing power to manage thousands or hundreds of thousands of moving components on a screen. He wasn't sure if the same thing could be said about this simulated world he was in now. My lord, the enemy is retreating, should we pursue them? No, we don't have the manpower for that quite yet, just have them take the weapons of the ones we managed to defeat. Of course, my lord. At first, it might have seemed that it would be a good thing to chase after them. They would not be able to gain that much from taking their equipment. After the battle was over, the bodies of the defeated soldiers started flashing just like the commander did. They had already enough that dropped here. There was no reason to endanger the troops or his encampment. This might be a lot more complicated than I assumed, but I also still need more information. Creating more scout units and establishing a proper army is my top priority now. After the battle was over, Roland was sitting in his throne room, which had slightly shifted to a more robust-looking one. There was still no padding for his behind, but at least there was some fuzzy hide for his back. Some time had passed since he won the duel with the enemy commander and received the rewards. He continued expanding his economic empire as he realized that everything that he was making required resources. As he saw it, there was probably a way to win this scenario by just outturning his opponents. If his army had enough time to grow and if he could equip it with the best gear around, then no one could destroy his fortress. Since the small skirmish, his town center and the fort had been upgraded to the next level. After gathering enough stone resources and wood, he was able to progress. It was quite a sight to behold when he clicked the button, as the whole place went through a fast change. More flicking occurred and the buildings just changed shape and expanded in scope slightly. The market building didn't need upgrading. After the center leveled up, the number of merchants was doubled and he was also able to buy more stock. Iron weapons decreased in cost and steel ones became more prevalent. Some deep steel ones even appear on the market, which he was tempted to stock up on. These were the type that he had a lot of practice with and could potentially change into game-changing weapons with his runes. A few new buildings appeared after the upgrade, including a chapel. It would allow him to train cleric units, which informed him that he was getting more magic into the mix. There was no way to produce mages yet, but it wouldn't be strange if there was a way to get them later. Then there was also an academy building that appeared. It was a research building focused on queuing in new technologies. At the moment it didn't have much besides a few options. One of them was masonry while the other one was a guard tower. It didn't show what this would produce after finishing, but the name gave him an idea. Masonry would probably allow him to change out the palisade walls made of tied together logs into proper stone walls. Then the guard tower would probably be a palace to store his archers and give him a way to defend his fort even better. With the dawn of the academy, he also realized that the blacksmith's building served a similar purpose. It was actually a research building in disguise, as creating better weapons and armor would boost his new units. The moment a new unit was built, it would come equipped with some default gear, and this would depend on the level of the smithy. Previously the units he encountered only had thin leather or fur armor on. After being able to produce half-plate iron armor and even steel armor, the new recruits started coming out pre-equipped with metal armor parts. Archers that wore light armor came out with hide variants, so it was enough to produce heavy armor to have the light and medium counterparts appear. I guess to sum it up, I need regular houses for civilians to increase my population. I can then assign jobs to those people, either send them off to be regular workers or turn them into soldiers. I won't be able to assign them to anything if there isn't enough food being generated. The same goes for water. Roland had to keep tabs on a lot of things during this trial. The previous one, where he just needed to focus on fighting and crafting, seemed like a breeze compared to this one. The thing didn't even start, but he was already not sure what he should invest into. Building up stone walls and guard towers felt like the obvious thing to do, but he could also spend the resources on other things. Defending isn't the only option. His scouting unit had gone around this whole area and discovered a few locations that were worth looking into. There were other settlements out there that didn't belong to his current opponents, the Kindlings. They were similar forts comparable to the one he just started in, but with fewer defenses. This gave him a choice to invade and take their resources. These settlements all had town centers and markets that could store resources. They also had basic smithing buildings that could have some raw materials and weapons for him to take. This gave him the choice to focus on building a strong army before the fortifications were up. If they were successful in taking over those places and he gained all of their resources, he would be profiting heavily. Being the aggressor wasn't really Roland's style of strategy. Even back in his home, the way he won was by luring stronger opponents into traps or using his runic weapons at the right time. Here he would have to go a bit out of his comfort zone if he decided to become a warlord. Aid, is there anyone else trying to invade our lands? Our scouts haven't detected any movement from our enemies, but we expect the kindlings to return. It might not be wise to focus on one strategy, but Roland's life success mostly came from his work ethic and bunkering down. He did have some experience in managing things like his smithy and store, but this didn't necessarily translate well to this trial. A choice had to be made: would he go on the offensive and spread out his armies through these lands and perhaps even join them? Or was it better to do what he was good at, which was creating a fortress protected by mechanical golems and turrets? It's probably better to stick to my guns. Splitting his forces and resources was not the way to go. In his mind, he could already see this palace turning into a giant fortress that could not be captured by anything. With deep steel already at his disposal, there wouldn't be much trouble in creating actual turrets. After designing one working model, the blacksmith could create it. He had all the schematics in his mind, and another NPC appeared in the upgraded smithy, which made things go even faster. In all honesty, Roland felt that he didn't prepare for this trial, but at the moment it didn't feel like it would be a problem. The first enemy that he faced wasn't all that strong, and if he continued to outfit his small army with better weapons, victory awaited him on the other side. It was always like that: quality won over quantity, and one magical turret would be able to take out multiple enemies easily in a defensive battle. Yet, most of my designs are better at defensive battles or at complementing my runic armor. His mind was made up: he would turn this into a base defense mission, as the trial didn't state that he had to actually attack anyone to win. The winning conditions had not been announced yet, but after establishing an impenetrable fortress surrounded by magical defenses, he expected to get an answer. Days started flying by as he continued to establish his defensive measures. Soon the wooden walls turned to ones made from stone, and large towers started to appear between them. From a motte and bailey fort it changed into a stone keep surrounded by higher walls, a deeper moat, and even long-ranged defenses that could be fired through slits in the walls. Just as he expected, the enemy nation came back after around a month's time to attack him again. The army that consisted of a bit above 200 wooden soldiers doubled in numbers. Their weapons had been enhanced and multiple commander units appeared as well. However, even if Roland's army only consisted of 100 soldiers, they had something that the enemy didn't have: runic magic. The turrets that he designed to protect his own home were able to rain down magical bolts on the approaching enemy. Even though the walls suffered some damage, the siege failed again. This only boosted Roland's faith in his current strategy: even without attacking other settlements or meeting armies out at the field, he could win. There was also a way to fast forward through some of the events. His bedchamber was a bit unique, as before going to bed he could put in a slumber period. It was possible to automate through a few events that would normally take days or weeks to be created. It was like hastening the speed in some games to have buildings be assembled faster, and he sometimes used the option for buildings to be assembled. The blacksmiths could copy his designs faster, but it also took some time, and thanks to this option he could hasten the time frame of this trial. Nevertheless, as time continued to tick down and weeks turned into months, he noticed that something was off. Even though his stone keeps turned into a concentric castle with 2 layers of defensive walls, there was no sign of the trial ending. The nation of Timberlings had actually fallen after a couple of months and was replaced by a stronger faction with actual siege weapons. Defending against them had become a lot harder, and even after assembling a full runic armor similar to his back home, he was starting to lose more. Usually, the weapons and armor that were gained from a victory could be sold on the market to gain better material. There was even an option to trade them out in bulk for something else, like deep steel or better materials to construct his defenses. Even though his units had gained special skills in handling his runic devices similar to the ones Bernier used, they were not able to hold on. This was not something that he could predict, as the trial didn't seem to have an end. It was not that his defenses were bad or that he was managing his castle badly, but due to it not being possible to complete this trial in this way. The moment he made the decision to turn this into solely a defensive game was the moment he lost it. There was no end to the waves of invaders, and he had quickly become surrounded by one large empire that conquered everything and everyone. So, this was not about defense but about defeating all of the other groups. Now that he was surrounded from all sides, it didn't really matter that his castle was an impervious fortress. He would not be able to continue this trial without defeating his opponent, and as it stood, his strategy wouldn't allow his forces to win. They had access to all the resources now and would slowly whittle him down. Even if he managed to continuously win over his enemies, without capturing all of their bases, there was no end to this. With how he had focused on defense, there was no room to switch. If he started assembling siege weapons, he would not have enough resources to repair the damaged walls, turrets, and golems that he assembled. Yet he couldn't just give up. It wasn't over yet. Perhaps there was a way to victory? Shit, what's that? The answer to his question came in the form of a massive army that was led by a strange-looking puppet. It was not made of wood though, it was fully composed of some sort of metal and looked more human than any of the others. It stood like a last boss on top of the hill while his castle was being bombarded by catapults from all sides. It didn't offer him even an option of a duel as it charged together with a bunch of heavy armored mounted units towards the main gate. I actually failed. Roland was jolted from the chair he sat on while remembering the metallic puppet's weapon smashing his head. A familiar ceiling and tools greeted him as he was now in his workshop where he activated the class change crystal. The same crystal had now turned to powder right in his hand. The time he spent in that trial was longer than back when he was getting his engineering class, but in the real world, only a few seconds had gone by. His mind was still foggy as the hit to the head that had delivered the killing blow felt quite real. The monster he needed to face was just too strong. It was even more troublesome than the lich he had to face, and there was nothing he could do during that last siege. Ah! I need to calm down. While he had failed, this wasn't over yet. There were more crystals to go through, but even when he held a new one in his hand, there was no way of activating it yet. There was also another big problem. Considering that he failed a Tier 3 trial, the usual period of waiting for only 1 day would be increased by some number. Then if he continued to fail his trial, it would keep increasing even further. It was possible for a person to continue failing these tests continuously until the period became so large that they wouldn't actually be able to retake the test ever again. To not allow something like this to happen again, Roland needed to decide on a new tactic and also put more thought into leading an army. Chapter 308. Shit, what was it again? I can't remember. Is this ascension-induced amnesia? So that's how it feels like. Roland grasped his head while trying to remember some of the knowledge he gained related to his new class. There were holes in his memory whenever he tried to remember some of the specifics that transpired during the Ascension trial into the Overlord class. This was something that he expected after failing in his transformation, but it was still a strange feeling. First of all, he only remembered some parts, but mostly the beginning. It was kind of a blur after defeating the first commander unit and getting past the tutorial phase of the whole trial. After that he couldn't really remember anything specific. The path that he took was defensive in nature, but he couldn't remember which specific upgrades he went with first. Everything specific that could be seen as an advantage was being forgotten, but some partial events were still there. This wasn't anything new to him, as he had read up on situations where people had failed their trials. In some situations, people would be left with nothing and could only recall activating a trial before appearing back in the real world with no recollection of anything. However, sometimes bits and pieces would be left behind, and some theories floated around proclaiming that a high enough resistance to mind-related effects could help alleviate this disadvantage. He could recall the monster that he was fighting and its huge mace going toward his head. It was like waking up from a nightmare, as he was also covered in a cold sweat. If he didn't have the crumbled pieces of the Ascension crystal in his hands, he could even believe that. Even though he had forgotten a lot, there was some information that would allow him to probably go into the next one with more preparation. I guess bunkering up in a fortress won't work. How much time did I even spend there? It's like a blur, but it must have been multiple months. Could it have been close to a year? Roland had lost his perception of time. It was like waking up from a fever dream. Luckily he knew what to do to keep some of his memories intact. When straining his brain on the dreamlike experience, he could recall some of the key events that led to his downfall as an overlord. Through this method he could collect bits and pieces of the puzzle which he could then try to assemble later. The main one was his decision to stick to his comfort zone. After managing to defend his own home through turrets, mines, and other traps, he tried to do the same. While it took less to defend a reinforced position like a castle, there was a limit. If the invading armies were too large in number or were equipped with state-of-the-art siege weaponry, there was no chance of him winning. I think I put on a good defense, I remember lasting out for a while, but that won't work if the victory conditions are different. Through his blunder, he recalled his worst mistake. There was no winning by only defending in this trial. It became clear that only by dominating everything would he gain the title of Overlord. Considering that this title presented itself as a lord towering over all the other lords, it was obvious that he needed to take them all out to achieve victory. Perhaps this is the difference between the two classes. While getting up from his chair, he recalled the High Lord variant of his class. It wouldn't be strange to assume that that class version would have a similar trial. It happened often when the classes came from the same source and had a similar naming scheme. Considering that his High Lord class was lower on the totem pole, it might have been more lenient with him, and his approach of defending could have garnered him a passing grade. Now on the other hand, he was left wondering how much time he would lose due to his blunder. It was 24 hours for a regular class change, but considering that this was a special Tier 3 Ascension trial, this could take longer. This was something that Roland didn't want to happen. Failing a trial wasn't the end of the world and it could be retaken later. However, there was one problem. There was always a waiting period that continuously grew the more a person failed. The time he entered the Ascension Zone when he hit level 150 didn't count as he left before activating the test, but now he had actually gone through it all. The period usually doubles after each failure, but sometimes it could go over that. It will all depend on how much I have to wait now. There was no way for him to tell how long the cooldown for the crystal would take. There was no problem in getting new ones, and he had one already stashed away for this location. Resources weren't the problem. The only thing he was worried about was time. Usually, a person that failed a class up would need to wait for a day for the next one to become unlocked to him. Then if they failed again, it would take 2 days, then 4, and so on. He had heard of some cases where people were unable to get through their trials no matter how much they tried. Tier 3 class tests were a notch above the rest and usually had a longer cooldown period than just 1 day. Some people would remain without a new class even for years without an option to switch to something easier. Others would quickly change to something lesser after realizing that they did not have the skills required to progress in a more prestigious class. I just hope nothing happens before I change classes. Roland had to take into consideration that he was ill-prepared to take the Overlord test. Perhaps even if the trial unlocked tomorrow, it would have been better to continue leveling the skills that weren't maxed. There was also an option to gain some new skills through skill books before the second or third attempt. While this was the better way to approach things, in his mind, there was no time. With the emergence of the higher-ranked dungeon, the place would start to swarm with people that could make life difficult for him. The reason he chose to come here was that the dungeon was a mid-rank dungeon that lacked anything to attract Tier 3 class holders. His only cover was his engagement with Arthur Valerian, which made him somewhat untouchable inside the city, that is if no other nobles were involved. Now that this place had become an investment opportunity, he wasn't sure if some troublesome people would arrive. What should I do to prepare? After cleaning up the crystal dust from the workbench and looking over the other class change crystal, he decided to return to his house. There he was greeted by Agni, who didn't really know why his master was in such a depressing mood. Maybe I didn't go through those strategy books thoroughly enough. Considering that when he was going through all the books at the Arden estate when he was a small child, it was already a wonder that he remembered this much. His intelligence value that allowed his memory to be boosted only started to really help after he gained his mage class. It wasn't strange that he wasn't able to read into the crux of the strategy from books. Gaining knowledge through books also had its limit, and he certainly did not have any teachers explaining anything. The only thing he gained from back then was basic battle training and an idea of how to survive in the world. The next years were mostly used to study his craft as a runic blacksmith and then RuneSmith. There was no time to waste on learning obscure war techniques that he had no use of. Even if he was sent off into war, his role would probably consist of making runic weapons and not directing troops or taking part in the battle. There was just no point in time that he would have required that data, and it was probably one of the reasons that he failed. Where could I get information on how to lead a fort or command troops? Wait, I think there were books about that in his office. Roland frowned a bit as he realized where his next destination was. Arthur Valerian was a noble and he had an excessive library in his own office and now new home. There were books on all sorts of things when it came to running a city. When he visited him from time to time, he was left looking at bookshelves filled with books. Some of them were related to combat out on the field. If he wanted to actually go out and conquer others, then he would need the basic tactics to go along with them. It wouldn't hurt to refresh my knowledge, maybe I'll find the things that I missed. There was no reason not to go there and go through the written information. The only uncomfortable part would be his explanation. Arthur could start asking questions and telling him the details of his Tier 3 class up test was off the table. They weren't really friends either, so perhaps a trade needed to be struck. There was also a library in the city that could have some historical records or tips. I guess I'll go to the library first and then try to think of a way to get Arthur to lend me those books. After groaning a bit, he decided to return to his workshop. Once there, after grabbing a hammer, he started destroying the same golem that he used his new skill on. It was the middle of the night and he was not tired at all. Using this time to level up his skills was the best way to prepare. Once dawn came, he was quick to pack up and head to the library where some new knowledge could be gained. When he arrived at the building that he had never really visited before, he was greeted by an old lady inside. This reminded him of some places he used to study back in college. Compared to the modern library in his old world, this one was rather small. After asking for books about warfare or old records of battles, he was met with mostly silence. Considering that knowledge was power, nobles did their best at hiding things that could make the populace rowdy. Thus, instead of getting some precise information, he was only left with some old historical records that he would need to interpret in his own way. Good that I learned this skill beforehand. Hastened reading level 9. Skill passive. Allows a person to read through text at an increased pace. While dropping a few old historical books at an old wooden table, he glanced at this skill. The reason he picked it up was to quickly go through contracts, but it also allowed him to read books at a rapid pace. From the outside, it seemed like he was skimming through the pages, but in reality, he was able to remember and then recall everything he went through. This was the max level version of the skill for Tier 2 class holders. It could be learned by anyone with a high enough intelligence rating, and it had no class restrictions. Thanks to him going through various runic books that he received from his friend at the academy, he was able to level the skill up rather fast. The harder the theme that a person was going through, the faster would this skill level up. Even with the skill working and his reading being quick, it would take some time to get through the books here. Considering that a lot of information here was things that he already knew, there was no use in spending more than a few hours going through it. Without anything specific, he could only take in old battle records that would require him to recreate the tactics himself. Thank you, please come again. Lending out books wasn't really a thing here, as no one had any time to monitor lent out books. A person could either stay in the library to read a book for a few coins or just write out by it if they wanted. With this just being a small-scale undertaking in a rather backwater city, it wasn't strange that it was mostly a waste of time. The things that were written down here weren't anything new, and thus his next stop would be at the Valerian villa. Should I give them a heads up? This was actually the first time he was there without Arthur assigning some type of work to him. Usually, he would get a commission of some sort which he either delivered himself if there was something to explain or just gave it to one of the delivery boys. Roland was not one to ask for favors, so this encounter was becoming quite stressful. Should I just talk to Mary instead? Arthur does seem to suspect that I'm some kind of noble, though. He might be okay if I just ask him. It didn't go unnoticed that Arthur was very lenient with him. Other nobles would have probably reprimanded him whenever he used unflattering language or performed the usual greeting in the wrong fashion. This didn't help him with the problem at hand. How should he ask for the books without making it sound strange and suspicious? While he sent a quick message to the villa, he continued about a good way of bringing it up. "Master Wayland, please come in." He nodded at the guards at the gate that let him through without complicating things. This time around it wasn't Mary but the butler that was once the mayor of the city that was the one greeting him. Considering that he was a competent craftsman with a lot of potentials, this was the proper way to handle him. Probably if Arthur knew that he was at the cusp of reaching Tier 3 he would have offered him a bigger greeting. "Is Mary here?" "No, she has other things to tend to. Would you like me to pass a message to her, Master Wayland?" No, that's fine." His first plan of having Mary go ask the question for him was shot down by the butler. He didn't know the man too well and felt more relaxed around the assassin maid. For some reason, he couldn't get himself to trust this man, so he would need to go with Plan B. "Is Lord Arthur present?" And he is. "Would a meeting be possible?" "Yes, the Lord is in his office. Please wait a moment and I'll go ask." To his surprise, he wasn't rejected outright. Instead, the butler just told him to wait. After only 5 minutes of waiting, he was then asked to go to Arthur's office where the Lord was going through some papers. It seemed that Arthur had told his retainers and villa staff to treat him as a VIP. There were no roadblocks for him, and even without having made a proper appointment, he was greeted with open arms. Could he be aware of my true level? This would make more sense if his new partner knew of him being close to Tier 3. Perhaps the Platinum Party had given him a report on the situation in the dungeon where he was able to clear out some Tier 3 monsters without their help. This could have been enough for Arthur to assume that Roland was in fact stronger than he seemed. There were also no witnesses back at his home to recount how the Lich had died. It wouldn't be strange to assume that he was strong. "Mr. Wayland, come in. You'll have to excuse me for this mess, but I didn't expect you to visit me today. I'll have to apologize for coming at a moment's notice." Soon he found himself walking into the office, which looked quite chaotic. Arthur's whole desk had a pile of books and papers on it, which allowed Roland to only see the top of his head. It was clear that he was busy with something which would perhaps make things easier to explain. "No need to apologize, but what is the purpose of your visit today?" "I came to ask for a favor." "For a favor?" Arthur quickly replied while continuing to focus not on Roland but on the parchments in his hand. "Yes, I've been working on a new runic operating system for a new golem design. If it wouldn't be a bother, could I borrow some books related to warfare?" "Warfare?" "Yes, I'm working on golems that could work together with soldiers out on the field, but I'm just a RuneSmith, so knowing about the tactics the current armies use would be a lot of help." It was the thing he came up with which was only partially a lie. In the trial area, he was building golems, and if he could program a few battle strategies into their operating systems, then it could help him. "Ah, yeah, sure, Ferdinand." "Yes, my lord." "Help Master Wayland get the research material that he needs, and oh right, there might be some books that catch his eye here, so help him out." "Of course." To Roland's surprise, Arthur didn't mind him borrowing books, and he was actually quick to catch on. The books in his office were the usual ones that were printed at the Knight Academy, which some nobles frequented. It wasn't strange for Arthur to have them, and lending them out wouldn't be a problem, as most knights in commanding positions had gone through them as well as other nobles. Why did he want those books? I wonder why. Did he figure something out? I'm not sure it's related. It might actually just be research material for a new golem design, Lord Arthur. Yes, we should not worry about Master Wayland. If he knew what was coming, he might have actually left the city. After Roland's visit, Mary and Arthur were the only two people left in his office. The untidy desk had been cleaned out by the maid, and both of them were looking at an opened letter. The crest of the Valerian household had been imprinted on the seal that was opened. "They will arrive here in 2 weeks, and I'm not sure what my dear brother is planning to do. Have you found some capable allies? Regretfully, the team of adventurers we recently hired might not arrive in time again. They have been delayed, and I'm not sure if that guild master will be of much help either." "Ha! No worries, we'll just have to hold up long enough for the cavalry to arrive." Both of them remained silent while looking at the opened letter. It wasn't something that they could ignore, nor did they know who the people arriving would be. They could only hope that the preparations that they went through would be enough, but as it stood now, things were looking bleak. Chapter 309. Time continued to tick as Roland gathered all the books about warfare that he could find in the city. He had even made a trip to the black market and the auction house to see if there was something interesting to be gotten there. To no surprise, the only worthwhile material was at Arthur's mansion, and with his help, he was able to acquire all the basics and some more intricate books. There was a lot to go through and not everything was correct. Even though something was made into a book, it didn't mean that no mistakes were made during its creation. When going through all this knowledge, he started recalling some strategies from the scriptures he unearthed in the old Arden Estate library. It wasn't that he had forgotten it all, he just needed a little jolt to help him gain it back. Even with the stress resistance skill, it wasn't that easy to recall what people before him went through. Now he felt slightly more confident in tackling the trial again. It's taking a while, it has already been more than a week. While sitting at his research table, he looked at the crystal in his hand. Even though he was ready to give it another try, it wasn't activating. This didn't bode well for him, as the longer the first reset period was, the harder it would become to retake the test again. To his knowledge, doubling the time between tries was what usually happened, but there were exceptions. It was possible for it to triple or perhaps even quadruple. This had already taken more than a week, 9 days to be precise. I can feel something, wouldn't this make it 10 days on the clock? Roland finally noticed that the crystal was resonating with his touch. He had stayed up till late at night, as this was the exact same hour that he had come back from the trial space. This meant that it took precisely 240 hours for the reset to occur. So if it doubles for the next one, I'll have to wait for 20 days? If it triples for 40, and then... His mind was filled with a long time frame, a setback that he didn't want to imagine. It was possible that it could even take 1 or 2 months for his third try, or perhaps even longer. He wouldn't really know unless he tried, but it was clear that if he failed for the third time, the time frame would start to become troubling, and at that point, it wouldn't be strange to pick the lesser option, that was the High Lord class. This wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Most people that attempted Tier 3 class changes failed on the first attempt. They failed even with the easier classes, so Roland's first failure could be excused by his inexperience. Time was a resource that he had painfully learned in the current trial. If it continued for too long and he was unable to clear this hurdle, it would have been better to lower the difficulty. I'd have to take into account that the High Lord class could have an entirely different trial, and that I might also fail it at first. Roland wasn't sure what the cutoff point would be, but he needed to calculate everything. If the reset period started to turn into multiple months, it would get incredibly dangerous. Even though he wasn't focusing on it for now, there was something in the air. Arthur didn't say anything, but it was obvious that there was something happening in the background. It wouldn't be strange if he didn't have more than a month to perform this change if he wanted to safeguard this home that he built for himself. I just won't fail again. He was not really a stranger to failure, it actually happened on almost a daily basis. His craftsmanship was still not the best, and he was still deficient in some segments of his craft. The situation he was in now was practically due to multiple deficiencies, one of the main ones being his propensity to run away when things started going wrong. It was a miracle that he was able to keep himself from leaving this place already. Without becoming used to the people around and growing some tighter bonds, he would have probably left a long time ago. In his right hand, he had the crystal that would let him back into the trial area. In his left hand, he had a large mug filled with some leftover tea that he had just drunk. On the side, it had his name on it, and while the mug didn't look all too great, it had a lot more sentimental value to Roland. It had been given to him by Lydia, as he had continued to use her set whenever she started hanging around his house. Now it was a part of their history that he was unwilling to throw away. Let's go, I've learned all that I can. It was time to go back to it. All the books about leading troops that he could find were read, and all the skills that were useful continued to be leveled up. Perhaps it would have been better to wait a few months and do more research, but the foreboding feeling didn't go away. Roland felt that if he failed this trial again, that there would be terrible repercussions. His vision quickly faded and he appeared back in the old apartment complex. Without waiting, he made his way up to activate the trial that he had failed. It's still there. He dreaded the moment of opening up the PC, as there was a chance that the class could have vanished. While he didn't have anything to base his fears on, when he saw the RuneSmith Overlord class there, he let out a sigh of relief. In this fake space, Roland had a bit more time to think everything over as time worked differently. It took a few moments for him to gather the courage, but soon enough he found himself in a familiar storage area like before. Will it be the same? From the information that he had gathered, usually, the trials remained quite similar after failing them once. Some were identical while others changed a few things around. After going up through a similar set of stairs, he realized that he was in the former type. My lord. It's close to the previous one, but the layout is slightly off. The puppied aide looked the same as he remembered him. Luckily, his memories of the beginning part of this test were still vivid in his mind. He could recall all that he did and also his decision of going with the defensive strategy. The fort was quite similar to the old one, but there were some minor differences. The wooden log walls appeared to be wider on one side than what he remembered. There was also a change in the topography of the region, with the forest area changing with the mountain region where he found the iron mine and built the quarry. My lord, there is no time to waste, we must prepare. Yes, yes, the kindlings are coming. Kindlings? No, my lord. Oh? Not the kindlings, what is our enemy called this time around? It's the dreaded lumberlings. While the name of his opponents changed, the scenario was playing out the same. He had the exact same time left before they would be arriving, and this time this group would be coming from a different location. His faction retained its Timberling naming sense, but it seemed that the map was procedurally generated by this trial system, just like in some strategy games. Roland theorized that this was done so that the person taking the trial wouldn't be able to keep to the old strategies if they retained some information from their previous test. The name Lumberlings sounded familiar, and it was a faction that he encountered later in his previous attempt. After hearing their name uttered by the aide, some of the past flashed in his mind. Before the aide could continue talking, Roland quickly ran into the fort throne room where he couldn't be followed. The console on the big wooden chair was still there, and he could quickly select the production of the stable along with scout units. Perhaps he had lost the previous trial, but it didn't mean that he had been mistaken about every tactic. Getting together more information about the area around his fort was paramount to his victory. Then there was his small army of 50 men. This was probably the most mismanaged part of his previous tactic. He wasn't sure what he had done with them, but he had some flashes of having a lot of archers. Considering that he was going for a defensive bastion, ranged weaponry would have been the way to go. Together with the magic turrets, it would have been quite a difficult formation to break. He was at least sure that he managed to hold out all the way until one faction conquered all the others. This was the crux of his failure and needed to be taken into consideration. First of all, he could not let his men remain stationary in this fort. The moment the scouting unit was made, they needed to be ready to move. At the start of this trial existed many smaller settlements with their own population and fortifications. They needed to be conquered by him in some way to not allow them to fall into the hands of the enemies. Sooner or later one of his enemies would tip the scale and become undefeatable by the other NPCs. There were ways for tackling this issue. The basic one would be to just meet them in battle out on the field. If he managed to defeat their armies, then it would be over. However, the biggest issue with that plan was leaving himself up to being invaded by others. In his previous attempt, he overused all his defensive strategy knowledge and had been defeated. If he put everything into the offense this time around, failure would probably be right around the corner. Everything needs a balance. I need to capture new settlements, make them into my own and protect them so they can generate more resources. I just need to find a good balance between the two. This was the key to his victory, equilibrium. His first mission, which would be identical to the trial from beforehand, was a good example. He had used up a week's time just to walk all over the weak troops of the kindlings. There was no need for him to make all those explosive traps or that many runic arrow tips. There was so much more he could have done with that time instead, and this was his current objective, winning the first defensive battle with minimal effort and with a lesser engagement of his troops. Now that the time came, he needed to make his first big decision. His soldiers needed their weapons, and certain ones were better than others. In this world where people could be divided by classes, a person obviously went for the weapon they had skills in. Giving spears to swordsmen would do them no good, but was a swordsman even a good class in a war setting? In Roland's opinion, there were a few types of soldiers that excelled in this type of setting, and they were ones proficient in using pole arms. There were several types of pole weapons, like a poleaxe or the more famous halberd. However, in the current state of his army, he decided to go for something that was cheaper to manufacture, as it could be hammered out of just one piece of metal. His weapon of choice for his soldiers would be the gui's arm or a billhook, which were similar to each other. It was possible to evolve his soldiers into polearm users that covered a plethora of these weapons that varied in shapes and sizes. It was possible to go with a specialized class like a gui's armier or halberdier, but they would become locked into these roles. These would be better suited for his commander units that would level up faster than the others. Pole arms are better than swords in an open field and are easy to make. Great swords aren't bad either though, so I can equip a few swordsmen with those. After gaining enough resources, I can switch the bills into poleaxes, or what was that thing's name? Oh right, bec de Corbin. Think they don't call it like this here though. Transporting them through the field won't be hard either. When I get enough resources, I can start making shields and bows too. While a lot of names aligned with the one back at his home, some didn't pass over. The bec de Corbin was also a polearm, but could also work as a war hammer on one side. It could pierce through things like a spear, had a spike in the back and a hammer in the front, a true multi-purpose weapon that could go very well with his polearm regiment. It even came equipped with a disc guard that was quite good for defensive purposes. A polearm like a poleaxe was still designed to work along armor and against armor. In the beginning stages, perhaps going with something like a spear would have been better, as they were even easier to manufacture. Considering that he needed to plan for the future, it was better to invest in something that would elevate his soldiers in future fights. Considering later on it would become harder and harder to level the army, it was better to start out now while his enemies were still weak. The store and the blacksmith only offered very basic designs of the spear. This meant that Roland would have to use his time in fashioning the new weapon type by himself. Previously he would have thrown the notion of making new weapons away quickly. Instead, he would create more mines or exploding arrows for the coming siege. This time around, he decided to focus on preparing some better weapons for the future. His soldiers could gain skills and levels in two ways. One was training at the barracks and the other going into battle. The former was the faster option, but it also carried a risk with it. The moment a unit died, it would never be recovered, and he would need to train a new soldier just like in real life. This was, however, when this shifted into a slightly more game-like system. If he met some conditions, he could train better soldiers to suit the new weapons. This was also one of the reasons he was going to make a billhook and other pole weapons. This I at least remember. After a while I should be able to train soldiers from level 50 and they will be able to use weapons that had been previously made. This trial really just sees the soldiers as another resource, and I guess to win this thing, I might have to do the same. A general couldn't fear losing his forces, and luckily for Roland, his people looked like wooden puppets. Perhaps if he had to send actual people to die for him, he would not be able to make the hard decisions. Luckily, in this kind of setting where the people were replaced by wooden men, he would not get any nightmares even if they got slaughtered by his enemies. Thus time continued to fly as he got to work. The scout was used to examine the surrounding lands around the wooden fort. As before, the quarry was established along with all the other basic buildings. The time that he had previously spent on making all the exploding arrows was minimized, as he intended to deal with the attack in a different way. Most of the resources were instead pushed into equipping 40 of his soldiers. These were sent to the nearest settlement that was easy pickings. Roland had realized that the first tutorial siege was nothing more than a distraction. There was no need to over-prepare for it. Wasting time on making all those explosive arrows and mining the entire area could have been avoided. Making good use of the army he had was paramount and would help him achieve victory. He was the focus of the enemy invaders, and together with 10 archers, he was enough to defend against this cannon fodder army. Those lumberlings had a slightly different shade, but the composition of their forces is about the same. Good. My lord, please reconsider. It's fine, I'm more than enough to take them on. This will actually be quite educational. I have not faced so many enemies at once before. Just have the archers pick off the stragglers and leave the main gate to me. But my lord. The wooden aide was almost crying as Roland grabbed a shield and something that looked like a reinforced club. This was his current plan. With the difference in the levels of his opponents, there was no reason not to just battle them by himself. Even though it was 200 against 1, he was much stronger than his enemies, and besides his physical stats, there was also runic magic involved. I hope those guys will be enough to capture that settlement while I deal with these training dummies. It all starts now. Chapter 310. They are susceptible to flames at least. Roland had decided to face the small army of lumberlings that had replaced the kindlings that were in the first trial. The only flames coming from these wooden puppets were the ones that he had fashioned himself. By foregoing the old strategy of placing mines everywhere and spending days crafting explosive arrows, he was able to be a boss-level threat out on the field. First of all, he saved a lot of time by not needing to bumble around the settlement and just staying in the throne chamber. There, like a proper lord, he could give out orders by clicking the interactive menu, while previously he even visited all the buildings to see what they were for. All the resources were now allocated and his city was growing just like before, but with his spare time, he was able to gather more iron and actually prepare a better set of armor for himself. Thanks to it, he was able to blast the approaching enemies with a cone of flames that were quite potent. This battle allowed him to confirm one theory: the enemies didn't really care that much about the base if he was out of it. The moment he went in front of the walls, the enemy switched their tactic. Instead of trying to conquer the fort, they decided to kill the lord first. These puppet soldiers were quite weak. The vast majority of them were on the levels of his own soldiers that were comparable to the level 9 or 10 monsters in the Albrook dungeon. Their approach also wasn't different, as they tried to swarm him from the front, and this was the worst possible tactic against a magic user like him. All of the attackers were blasted by AoE-type spells. Killing 10 of the puppets at once was as easy as throwing a flame blast into their group. With the difference in stats, there was no way of them surviving the spreading magical flames. However, they still posed a threat, considering that his armor was only made of steel. The more he used, the more the runes continued to deteriorate. Fighting out on an open field is different than in a dungeon, but it isn't necessarily more difficult. As a couple of arrows were bounced away by the magical shield that was around his body, another group of around 20 soldiers attacked him from all sides. Before they could get to him, however, the earth under their feet started becoming soft. The sprint was interrupted by an area of effect that turned everything around him into a pool of mud. With them all being stuck, he just needed to harden the ground back and blast away with a torrent of flames to finish them off. This was one of the bonuses of fighting alone. He did not need to worry about hitting his own men. The archers behind the fort gave him some support as well. Roland just needed to point out with his hand to generate a magical blast. The tight-knit formations were a detriment to fighting him, and it was impossible for them to get into close range. Fighting from outside was also not possible, as his mana shield could not be pierced by the flimsy arrows shot by low-tier 2 archers. Nevertheless, after getting rid of around 100 of the wooden soldiers, his armor started becoming undone. The metal that he made it from could not handle the constant use of spells and had burned right through it. Luckily, to counter this effect, he had one new very helpful skill. Rapid machine reassembly was activated on the armor he was wearing. The holes that had been created by the magical symbols started to get filled back by more steel. For some reason, this skill worked not only on golems but also on runic armor like this. He had no idea how it created more steel out of nothing, but it didn't matter. With the armor mended back into its original state, he could take care of the next batch of soldiers without much of a problem, which only left their commander. This time around there was no challenge, as their leader just charged along with their troops at Roland. Perhaps if he had noticed the danger beforehand he could have offered a better fight, but after suffering so many deaths the enemy troops' morale was too low. It didn't help that their leader wasn't equipped with any magic countering items. Even a simple mana shield necklace could have given him some options during the last confrontation. Congratulations on your victory, the enemy forces tremble before your might and have lost the will to fight. Hey, what is this? I don't remember this part. The battle was won and he expected the enemy combatants to run with their tails between their legs. Instead of running, they started dropping their weapons and looking in his direction. It seemed if the enemy troops were overwhelmed they would just toss their weapons and give up. This wasn't all, however, as they just remained there without moving. Are they waiting for something? Could it be possible? An idea popped into his head after seeing the demoralized troops of the Lumberlings. This trial was similar to a strategy game, and it could also have a diplomacy mechanic behind it. Perhaps it was possible to convert the units of the opposition to his own side. This happened in real life. After the enemy leaders were dealt with, a takeover took place. Some madmen did kill all opposition without taking any prisoners, but usually, a lot of people would be spared and then used as a resource. Think they are waiting for me to say something? What would a lord say in a time like this? Roland was aiming to become an overlord, but he had not really gone through any proper noble training. His manners weren't all that refined, as no one had bothered to teach him when he was young. A noble was supposed to lead people, even though that usually wasn't true. A proper one was supposed to be a leader. They needed to either inspire respect or ingrain enough fear in people to force them to obey. Your leader is dead, surrender to me and I promise to spare your lives. If you try to run away, none of you will be spared, this I promise you. After picking up the large halberd that the enemy commander dropped, he pointed at the enemy troops. When he raised his voice he could actually see the wooden soldiers trembling out of fright. Then after a moment, they started dropping down to their knees in defeat. No one actually dared to make a run for it. There were about 30 of them left on the battlefield. If they spread in all directions, even Roland wouldn't be able to get to all of them in time. You have successfully dominated the demoralized Lumberling troops, but they are not yet ready to join your faction. Hey! Roland noticed a new message pop up before him. By the looks of it, there was a possibility of turning the opposing soldiers into his own. The hidden requirements weren't met though, but this gave him a few tips toward them. First of all, the key element was the lack of morale in any leader unit present on the battlefield. This sounds about right. Usually, soldiers would need to go through some kind of re-educating process or even get tortured to renounce their pledge to the old leader. Wait, could there be an option for this? Previously he bunkered up in a fortress and didn't really take into consideration that there were other choices to gain power. If it was possible to take over other settlements, it wasn't strange that he would gain their resources, and the wooden people were also part of them. This could save him a lot of gold that he would need to spend on training soldiers, but first he needed to go check back in his throne room for any new options that appeared. It wasn't strange for options to be hidden in tests like this, and it wouldn't be strange if new ones appeared in the research building. First I need to do something with these soldiers. I don't think they'll just wait out here and wait for me. The enemy soldiers were down on their knees and not moving. They were probably affected by something like a hidden leader's aura. It would of course vanish the moment he removed himself from the battlefield, and they could potentially start fleeing. Luckily there was one place where he could place these 30 soldiers. Good, gather up. If you don't resist you will not be killed, this I promise you as the Lord. Soldiers, detain them and take them to our underground dungeon. He still had the 10 leftover archers that didn't leave the fort along with the other troops. Even though it was 10 against 30 with Roland around, the enemy combatants would not dare to resist. The place came equipped with a small dungeon that had a few cells. It would be cramped for these 30 wooden puppets, but it was a place they could be kept until he found a way of dealing with them. It went quite smoothly as the archers descended from the makeshift battlements. With Roland at the helm of the group, they all walked into the wooden fort where all of them were stuffed into the underground dungeon that was under the barracks building. After it was all done, he ordered his remaining troops to gather up the spoils of war while he checked the throne room. There is an actual re-education camp for this purpose. Re-educational camp. Building. A prison camp for the purpose of indoctrinating enemy soldiers. Indoctrinating. They really aren't beating around the bush in this trial, but when speaking about indoctrination, Roland had unlocked the chapel building and he knew that religion was a big part of indoctrinating people in the real world. If what he assumed was correct, then perhaps a new unit besides a battle cleric was possible. To no surprise, an option appeared that required its own research to unlock. Clergyman. Civilian unit. Can convert others to your religion and heal units inside temple buildings. Can be placed in the re-educational camp to speed up the indoctrination process. It can't be used outside of the city, which is a shame, but I can use it to convert enemy units. Perhaps there will be a better unit that will be able to convert units out on the field. This was a possibility that couldn't be discounted. Religion was a thing that brought people together, and after building his first chapel he established his own. There had to be some common ground when trying to team up with old enemies, and religion was one of them. After seeing the new options popping up, Roland also realized that this was probably one of the big reasons that the Solarian Church had such power in the whole kingdom. Even though they could perhaps be a danger to the king's rule, they were necessary to hold the reins on the citizens in the kingdom. Something needed to connect people that were living together. In the beginning, it was easy as tribes stayed relatively small, but the more everything grew, those close ties began to matter more and more. He wasn't sure if this trial would have anything similar, but at least the option to convert others to his side was there. If used right, it could save him a lot of military costs. It might have been good that I couldn't just convert them instantly onto the battlefield. I don't think my current settlement can even support those 30 soldiers. Right next to the gold counter was the population number. While in strategy games it was impossible to go over this number, it wasn't the same here. It was slightly more intricate, as he would suffer a debuff if the number went into the red. Starvation didn't happen in just one day, so this could also be used to his advantage. Even if he went over the threshold, he would have some time to work things out before a serious problem arose. Did they capture that settlement? While setting up his educational system, he noticed that the number representing his current population shot up. It wasn't just that the limit went up, he had also gained more people in general. This could only mean one thing: his attacking force had managed to capture the nearest fort to his own. To his surprise, there was an update to the system window. Only after a few seconds the population cap increased. Instead of the white text on a black screen that he was used to, he was taken to some kind of graphical interface. There he could see a map of the area that looked like a generic overworld minimap in some games he used to play. He could see his main settlement that was in the middle, and in the northern east region the new one he acquired. The population limit on his current fort was 100 people. When counting in the 50 or so soldiers and over 40 civilians and workers, he had been almost at the limit. This new one had added a further 50 to the cap, and it was also possible to build more village buildings and farms there. That settlement is behind mine, and they only had around 20 combatants without a captain unit around. I lost 3 from the 40 soldiers that went there. After going through the console again, he managed to find a recap of the battle. It really was like in a game, as he saw a small recap of what had happened. The soldiers that died were the first ones that scaled the wooden fortification, but soon after the whole place was overrun and victory was achieved. No one had surrendered, and the faction that was placed there had disappeared from the map entirely. What are the losing conditions, to be exact? Roland wasn't sure what he needed to watch out for yet. Considering that he was playing the role of a noble leader, he needed to survive. Last time his head was turned into paste by some type of enemy that he couldn't really remember well. What made up a lord were his subjects and his territory. Probably if he lost all his strongholds, then it would be over. Without an army and followers, there was nothing to lord over. This was a test of being a lord, and losing all of his forces and terrain would probably make him a bad one. However, this could mean that I don't necessarily need to keep this location. as long as I retain at least one settlement it shouldn't trigger the losing condition. At the moment he was in the black as he didn't recall much past this point. After killing the first commander and building up his defensive structures, it became a giant hole in his memory. One of the reasons that he had lost the defensive battle was due to the location of this fort. It had no natural defenses to safeguard him from being attacked. This meant that he needed to equally build up an impenetrable fortress from all sides. If he at least had one side that was safe, he would be able to save a lot of gold, and perhaps lasting out for longer would have been possible. Could this be a dead end created by the trial? What if I was never supposed to stay in this fortress, to begin with? Hey Aide, bring me all the information about those lumberlings, send out the scouts too. I want to know the specs of their fortress. Specs, my lord. All the details, the number of their troops, but more importantly if there are any natural defenses around them. Roland started wondering, probably to be victorious in this test he couldn't just go to the next extreme that was attacking. Sooner or later, while his army was out conquering, he would be attacked by an enemy faction. To not lose important strategic locations he would need to at least have enough time to call back the troops. Instead of a full offensive, he needed to settle somewhere in the middle. If this fortress was meant to fall from the start, he just needed to find another one that would allow him to save on some expenses in the long run.